What are some popular economic fallacies and why are they wrong? What's holding Africa back from economic development? And Cuba still has bread rations? I'm Dominic, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the middle of the woods in Vermont, where socialism grows amongst the trees. Of course, that's not really true. Socialism doesn't really grow in Vermont. I'm just making a little bit of fun of Vermont's senior senator, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is, of course, a self-described Democratic socialist, and he's the independent senator from Vermont. He's not a Democrat. But his Twitter feed is a reliable source of unreliable information. And so I just wanted to go through a little bit of it today. Just some of the recent things he said, because, I'm not doing this to pick on Bernie Sanders in particular. I'm not trying to single him out. I think he says a lot of things that a lot of Americans believe. I don't think he is inventing this stuff. I don't think he's the source of the problem. I think he is speaking on behalf of what a lot of people think. And so I think it's important to sort of go through some of the things he says and show why they don't make any sense, or things he's missing out that might complicate the picture a little bit. So just going through a couple of his recent tweets. Here's one he has. It says, Donald Trump has been in 3 political campaigns. He was president for 4 years. We're in the midst of a serious healthcare crisis. 85 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured. And now he's working on a concept of a plan. That's not going to cut it. This is referencing Trump's comments in the debate with Kamala Harris, where he said he has concepts of a plan for healthcare, and that we'd be hearing about it in the coming months. It was sort of a non-answer to a question about healthcare that was given there. And, I wanted to start off with this one because Bernie's got a point here. He's totally got a point. Donald Trump really has shown that he doesn't really have any comprehensive way of thinking about healthcare problems, and that's unfortunate. He should. It's an important issue, and it's somewhere around 1/6 or 1/5 of the American economy is involved in the healthcare industry in some way. And he's running for president, and so he should have a better position on that. We talked about this issue on the Qualified Opinions podcast, the other AIER podcast hosted by Veronique DeRougy. I was a guest on there along with Akash Chogali, and we talked about this there, and I was very critical of Trump on there, so I encourage you to go listen to that. So that's a legitimate point from Bernie. What he says, though, here is we're in the midst of a serious healthcare crisis. 85 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured. Okay, now this is where it gets a little iffy. 10 years ago now, the Affordable Care Act came into effect, 2014, also called Obamacare. This was a law that Democrats passed that was supposed to fix this problem. They promised that this would fix the problem of uninsured people, that it would make sure that everyone's healthcare coverage was up to a certain level so that they would be covered for lots and lots of different things. They said it would prevent you from being denied coverage for pre-existing conditions, all those sorts of things. And this was supposed to be a revolutionary law that really changed American healthcare and fixed these problems. And it's been in effect for 10 years. 10 years. And politicians are still talking about the exact same problems. Uninsured and underinsured. 85 million people, Sanders says. So, from one sense, this makes this is excusable from Sanders specifically because, like I said, he's not actually a Democrat. He's an independent. And he has called for total government health insurance. And so he would say that Obamacare was bad because it didn't go far enough, because it was a half measure, because it still keeps the private insurance industry intact. and was actually supported by the private insurance industry. And so he would say that that's wrong because of those reasons. And so from Sanders' point of view in particular, it's totally consistent. He's not saying anything inconsistent here. But politicians in general, because Kamala Harris will go out and talk about this stuff too. And she is a Democrat, and she did support Obamacare. And so they'll go out and talk about this stuff too, and talk about it in the same way. And this is just a pattern from politicians. Separating it from the healthcare issue, this is a pattern from politicians that they will talk about a problem, they will say we need to pass a law to fix the problem, and then they actually pass the law, and they're still talking about the same problem. We're going to see this happen again with infrastructure. The United States passed a $1 trillion infrastructure bill in 2021 because supposedly our infrastructure was crumbling and everything was falling apart, and we needed this massive spending bill to fix this problem. But here's the deal. Politicians are still going to be talking about crumbling infrastructure because they're always talking about crumbling infrastructure. I looked at particularly the bridge program in the infrastructure bill, which was a very, very small portion of the $1 trillion, by the way. But it's what a lot of people talked about, that we need to repair bridges because bridges are falling apart. And the Department of Transportation said there's somewhere around 40,000 structurally deficient rated bridges. That doesn't mean they're falling down. It just means that they are they're sort of the top priority in need of repair. And there are 40,000 of those. And the infrastructure bill said, despite spending $1 trillion, they were going to fix 15,000 of them. And this was celebrated as a huge win. We fixed 15,000 bridges. So first of all, that's assuming that politicians keep their word and we actually fix 15,000. But let's say that we do. Let's say that we do. Let's say it works and we get 15,000 bridges fixed. There's still going to be like 25,000 bridges out there that are still structurally deficient. So the next politician can come along and say, we have 25,000 structurally deficient bridges. We need a $1 trillion infrastructure bill to fix this problem. And maybe they'll fix 15,000 more. Well, there's still 10,000. So the next politician can come and do the same thing, right? So this is a pattern in politics that we see a lot. And, this is just one example of it from Sanders, but we see this a lot, and it's one of the reasons why we shouldn't trust politicians to do a lot of this stuff, because they don't actually end up fixing the problem. They end up perpetuating it because they know that they can go out and campaign on the problem. Okay, let's go to another Sanders tweet. So Amazon. He says Amazon generates $36 billion in profits a year. It's not radical to think that their workers shouldn't live in poverty. And this is supporting Teamsters' efforts to unionize Amazon. So this one is much more specific to Sanders because he picks on Amazon a lot. A lot of people do, but him especially. And he's talking about how they generate $36 billion in profits, and so they should pay their workers more. That's basically the gist of this. And Amazon can look at this and say, look, we did what you wanted. Amazon has, at the corporate level, they have a $15 an hour minimum wage. That was the progressive demand from a couple of years ago. That was what Sanders wanted. Now Sanders says he wants sort of a phased-in $17 minimum wage. He's proposed legislation to that effect. So he sort of moved the target on Amazon. But not only does Amazon have a $15 minimum wage for its own employees, Amazon also lobbies Congress for a $15 minimum wage from the federal government. Amazon is doing the thing that Bernie Sanders presumably will want them to do, which is to use some of their influence to ask Congress to raise the minimum wage. Now, what Sanders probably won't say is that Amazon is doing this in its own self-interest. If Amazon can afford to pay a $15 minimum wage to all of its employees, if it gets the government to raise the minimum wage to $15 for everyone, that prevents them from ever being undercut on labor costs. If everyone is forced to pay $15 an hour, and Amazon already pays $15 an hour, then they never have to worry about getting undercut by other businesses. So it's perfectly smart for Amazon to ask Congress to do this. Congress hasn't done it, of course. But this is an area where Amazon and Bernie Sanders actually agree for different reasons, but they do agree. And yet Sanders is still attacking them on social media. So this should be a lesson to corporations that if politicians think it's in their interest to attack you, they're going to do it no matter what you say. So acquiescing to a lot of the things that they want to do, if you don't think you need to do it, you don't have to. All right, here's another tweet from Sanders. It is absurd that a billionaire in America today pays the same amount of Social Security taxes as someone making $168,000 a year. It's time to scrap the cap, expand benefits, and fully fund Social Security. So this is a common complaint that you hear across the political spectrum as well. This is not specific to Sanders. What he's talking about is that the Social Security payroll tax, which is 12.4% on taxable earnings, is capped at $168,000 a year of earnings. So people who make more than that, they pay taxes up to $168,000, or they pay the payroll tax up to $168,000, but they don't pay beyond that amount. And people look at this and say, "Oh, that's unfair. How can you do that?" The reason that cap is there is that it corresponds with another cap, which is the cap on the benefits you receive when you retire. The payroll tax is capped at $168,000 because taxable earnings that are used to calculate your benefits are also taxed or are also capped at $168,000. And so people don't receive benefits on anything beyond that either. And we shouldn't want that. Okay, that's crazy. Social Security has a formula that it uses. It looks at your earnings during your career and how much you paid into the system. And then it calculates, based on that, how much you should receive benefits. So people who make more money receive higher benefits, because the idea behind Social Security was supposed to be an entitlement program, not a welfare program. It was supposed to be, the idea is you pay in while you're working, and then you get back when you retire. Now, that's not actually how Social Security works. In fact, most people get back in benefits more than they ever paid in. And so that's one of the reasons why the program is not financially sustainable. Another reason is that it adjusts for inflation in a much more generous way than is probably justified. And so they sort of overestimate inflation. So when they do cost of living adjustments on it, people get much more in benefits. And that difference might be 1%, 0.5% in any given year, but you add it up over someone's whole career of 30, 40 years. Now we're talking about a significant amount of money difference. And so that's what happens. So the reason for this cap existing, like I said, is because the benefits are also capped, and it's not supposed to be primarily a redistributive program, at least from rich to poor. What it is a redistributionary program from working people to retired people. Because again, it's not like your money is sort of put in a box somewhere that you paid in with your payroll tax and then you get it back later with interest. That's not how it works. How Social Security works is the people who are currently working right now are funding the benefits for the people who are retired. And the problem with that is that there's not enough working people relative to the number of retired people. So that's why Social Security isn't sustainable. If we want to raise taxes to fund Social Security, like Bernie Sanders suggests here, the Congressional Budget Office has looked at that, and they said if you want to raise the payroll tax to fund Social Security, you would have to raise it from 12.4% to a little over 16%, which is about a 35% increase in the payroll tax. And you'd have to do that for everyone across the board, not just rich people. And you'd have to do it permanently, forever, for at least the next 30 years. That doesn't sound like a great deal. Think about it this way. Would you rather have 35% higher payroll taxes to get the same Social Security benefit that you're promised right now. Because again, this isn't to expand benefits, which Sanders says he also wants to do. This is just to pay the benefits that you're already promised. To actually fully fund it with taxes, you'd have to raise the payroll tax by 35%. Payroll tax rate, I should say, by 35%. Would you rather fork that money over to the government? Or would you rather save that money on your own investment account, where the money actually does belong to you, where the account manager has a fiduciary responsibility, a legal obligation to get a high and stable return for you, and the money actually is yours when you retire? You're not taking money from people who are currently working. You're not crossing your fingers that there's going to be enough workers out there to fund your retirement. The money actually belongs to you. It grows in your own account. I'd rather have that, personally. All right. So this is sort of a weird. This is just sort of a weird one from Sanders. He says last year Coca-Cola Company spent $327 million on advertising in the United States, while the company raked in more than $9.5 billion in profits. Not one of their ads will tell you that drinking 1 or 2 cans of Coke a day will increase your chances of getting type 2 diabetes by 26%. So let's stipulate for sake of argument that all of that's true. I don't really know where he's getting that number from. I don't really know if it's actually true that 1 or 2 cans of Coke a day increase your chances of getting type 2 diabetes by 26%. But it is probably true that drinking a lot of soda increases your chance of getting diabetes. And I don't think anybody's really under the impression that Coca-Cola is good for you. I think most people who drink it are fully aware that it's not good for them. But they like the taste, and they like to buy it anyway. And so what is the takeaway supposed to be here? Again, he puts the numbers about profits and advertising budget that are just big and to make it sound bad, I guess. But what are we actually supposed to take away? Is Coca-Cola supposed to advertise that their product increases your chance of diabetes? Is that supposed to help? What other companies should do this? Should every company have to advertise the risks of using their products irresponsibly? Yeah, I think we can all say, like, if you're like only drinking Coca-Cola as your only beverage, that's not what the product is supposed to be used for, right? I don't think Coca-Cola would say you should you should be constantly drinking Coca-Cola. So what are we supposed to take away from this? Should every car company have to advertise that you could get in a car crash if you buy the car? Should stapler companies have to advertise that you could staple your hand on accident? Should right like what are we supposed to think about this? And this is really just sort of vilifying a company just because. And Sanders does this a lot, but again, he's not the only politician. Lots of politicians do this kind of thing. And they do it in this way that just doesn't really make any sense. All right, so this will be the last one. This will be the last one we do. He's quote tweeting a video of Tim Walz, the Democrat vice presidential candidate. He says, "Yes, Governor Walz has a defined benefit pension plan. That's good. He earned it. At a time when about half of older workers have no retirement savings, we've got to restore defined benefit pensions so that all Americans can retire with the respect and the dignity they deserve." So, first of all, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to the episode of Econception I did with Thomas Savage, where we talk about state pension programs and defined benefit pensions. One of the issues here is that just the math doesn't work for defined benefit pensions. So, to remind you what the difference is, a defined benefit pension says that you get a certain amount back based on a formula, and that amount that you get back is based on your earnings in your career, and that's the promise to you, is that you get that amount. And so workers pay into a fund. The fund is invested It's one giant fund. It gets invested, and then it pays out to workers according to this formula. The opposite of that is a defined contribution plan. That's like a 401k or a lot of different sort of individual retirement accounts. A defined contribution plan says that your employer promises you to match or contribute a certain amount into your own private plan every month or every paycheck or however they decide to do it. And your benefit is the amount that they contribute. And then that money is your own account. It's not one big fund like a defined benefit plan. That money is yours. It is in an account with your name on it. And it gets invested and you can see it grow over time. And then when you retire, all that money that you had belongs to you. So the guarantee is on the other end. That's basically the difference. The guarantee of a defined benefit plan is it guarantees the amount that you would get back when you retire. The guarantee for defined contribution is it guarantees the amount that you put in now. And then whatever that turns out to be when you retire, that's how much money you have. And so that the defined contribution model, like I said, that's 401ks. That's what most people in the private sector have. And that is very much the predominant way that people save for retirement in the United States. Defined benefit plans are really only exist anymore in the public sector, and a lot of public sector agencies are actually getting rid of them and phasing them out, especially for new employees, because the math just doesn't work. It's a similar problem with Social Security that we were talking about before. There are not enough people working and paying into a plan like this to cover the retirees who are not working. We have an aging population. We have people getting older and living longer. And so they are not only do we have more retired people, we have retired people spending more years in retirement. And as medicine gets better, that's probably going to become even more true. And so a defined benefit plan, which is based on people working, paying in, there just aren't enough people working relative to the number of people who are retired in order to make the math work for that. Defined benefit plans in the past have been full of fraud because they create these massive funds of money that are managed by other people. And so, especially with union defined benefit plans, lots of corruption. The money will be invested a lot of times for political purposes. So it will be for different sorts of diversity goals, environmental activism, things like that, because there are these huge pots of money sitting around, and that's just really tempting for people. Whereas a defined contribution plan, it is your money in your own account, your name on it, that you own. You own it your whole life. It actually belongs to you, as opposed to a defined benefit plan, which is a promise to give you money in the future from a bunch of money that doesn't belong to you. And so it's easy to see why a lot of workers actually prefer the defined contribution plan, despite what Sanders says here. And it's just not true that half of older workers have no retirement savings. We have lots of data from Federal Reserve, Household Finance Survey that shows that this just isn't true. Sanders says this all the time. But the supposed superiority of defined benefit plans just doesn't add up in the data. So that's enough of that for today. I think we might come back to a segment like this at some point in the future. I just think it's helpful to sort of walk through what Sanders says on some of this stuff, because again, I don't think he's saying these things just because he's inventing them. I think he's representing views that a lot of Americans actually hold. And I think it's important to sort of walk through what's missing and what's incomplete about a lot of the things that he does say. So we'll see you after the break. All right. Speaking of Bernie Sanders, Cuba. He has in the past been a supporter of Fidel Castro and the communist government in Cuba. Sort of a cheap shot there, but I had to throw it in because Cuba has announced that it's reducing its bread rations. And this just came out a couple days ago. This was recent. This was September the 16th of this year. Not 50 years ago. Not in some faraway place. 90 miles off of Florida, there is a country run by a communist government that is cutting its bread ration for its citizens from 80 grams a day to 60 grams a day. That is not a lot of bread, folks. That is not a lot. 80 grams isn't a lot. 60 grams is even less. So, how does this happen? Cuba has a ration system of price controls. They ration out resources and they cap the price that you can legally charge for it. And so the price for the 60 gram loaf of bread is capped at about 1/3 of a cent in US dollars. It's about 1 Cuban peso. 1/3 of a cent. That's what they've capped the price at. Now, if you're only allowed to charge 1/3 of a cent for something, are you going to put a lot of work into making it a really good product? Are you going to make sure you get the best ingredients for the bread if you're only allowed to charge 1/3 of a cent for it? Of course not. You're going to bake that bread as cheaply as you possibly can. You're not going to care what goes into it at all, because no matter what you do, you're not going to make any money off of it. So there's no point in going out and trying to get really good flour, get really good ingredients. Why would you do that? And so this is exactly what has happened in Cuba. Reuters interviewed someone in Havana who said that the flour tastes like acid. So that's working really great. From that story, they said Cuba's ration book, or libreta, as it is known among island residents, was once considered a hallmark of Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution, providing a range of deeply discounted products to all Cubans, including bread, fish, meat, milk, and cleaning and toiletry supplies. Today, the crisis-racked government offers just a fraction of those products, and often they arrive late in poor quality or not at all. So this is exactly what happens with communist systems everywhere. Reuters deserves some credit here because they straightforwardly attribute this to Cuba's communist-run government. That's exactly the term they use. And they include in the story, they say, beyond the few remaining centrally planned economies like Cuba's and North Korea's, rationing is typically only used during wartime, natural disasters, or specific contingencies. And that's true. Rationing used to be much more common in the world. But because of globalization, because of free trade, because of the prosperity that those things have caused all across the world, not just in the West, not just in developed countries, but in poor countries as well. They're still poor relative to the West, but in absolute terms, they're much better off than they were even 20 or 30 years ago, but certainly 100 years ago. And so most of these countries don't have to ration food anymore. Like they said, the only ones that do regularly still are the true communist countries, North Korea, Cuba, places like that. Even places like China, they don't ration food. They have enough of market systems in China, even though it still is very much a dictatorship. They have enough market systems in China that people are able to, for the most part, are able to buy food. Cuba and North Korea are really the only last places that do this. North Korea is basically the last place on earth that has famines. Sort of naturally caused famines are extremely rare now. This used to be a problem all over the world. You can look at old texts such as the Book of Common Prayer in England from the 1600s when they first started the Church of England. The Book of Common Prayer has lots of prayers specifically about food, specifically about harvest, about getting rain, things like that, because it was a very live problem for them. That if we don't grow enough food, we're going to die. People are going to starve. That was a problem in England, 400 years ago, which was a long time ago, but in world historical terms, it was really not that long ago. Pretty recent. Now, even really poor countries, at the very least, they don't have famines. where lots of people starve. North Korea still does. And Cuba still has this problem of rationing because they still have communist governments that still try to do this stuff. The communists in Cuba have had 65 uninterrupted years of complete power. And they've been unable to fix this problem. And it's because laws of economics say that's not going to work. But they keep doing it. And unfortunately, as long as they do, Cuba is going to remain poor. The poorest continent in the world is Africa. And lots of African countries have also had socialist pasts, and some still have socialist presence. Sort of far off colonial governments in Africa were replaced by socialist governments after independence in many cases. And one of the people who has been vocal about this problem is a woman named Magatte Wade. And she is an activist for free markets in Africa. She was born in Senegal, but she was mostly raised in France with her parents because Senegal just does not offer opportunities for people. And so lots of people leave. But she has come back. She's an entrepreneur. She has started multiple businesses that make products in Africa and then sell them in the United States. And the reason this is able to work is because American consumers especially are very conscious about how things are made, what ingredients go into them, that people are treated well. And so she is able to charge a premium for these products. She got a skincare company, for example, uses a lot of ingredients that are only found in Africa, employs lots of people in Africa, and so she's able to charge a premium for this in order to make it worthwhile. Because if she wasn't able to do that, it's almost impossible to do business in African countries. And the reason for this is overregulation. Obviously, there are lots of problems that Africa has with political violence, wars, unstable governments, all the rest of that. But from a business point of view, it's overregulation that's really the biggest problem. Wade talks about how if you look at the ease of doing business index, which is a publication that the World Bank puts out, the countries of Africa are all just grouped at the bottom. It's really, really hard to do business there. And people will say, oh, that's because of corruption, which is sort of true, but it's also begging the question, because the only reason that a lot of that corruption exists, the only reason you have to bribe people, to bribe government officials, is because those government officials have a bunch of rules in your way that prevent you from doing what you need to do. And a lot of this shows up in economic regulation. Most economic activity that happens in Africa happens informally, happens not registered with the government, happens with private people just setting up in marketplaces and selling stuff. And that's because it's almost impossible to actually start a real business. Now, again, Wade has done it, but she told me, I interviewed her for National Review, she told me about how she had to go talk to the head of the customs office in Senegal because there was no way that she could have done it otherwise. She had to have personal connections with people. She had to know people. They had to search for loopholes to try to figure out a way to make it work. And she was able to do it, but that's just not repeatable for a lot of people. What do you do if you don't know government officials? You just can't start a business. And so that's why there are so many people that leave Africa, that try to leave Africa. And they risk their lives to do it. This is especially a problem in Europe just because they share the Mediterranean Sea with North Africa. And people from sub-Saharan Africa will try to go all the way through the Sahara Desert, get to places like Libya, which is an absolute disaster, extremely dangerous place. They will get on boats and try to come across the Mediterranean Sea just to look for jobs. Because there's no jobs in Africa. Because you can't start businesses in Africa. And that's Wade's point. She says, look, the solution to poverty is prosperity. Prosperity comes from entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs need a business environment to succeed. If they don't have it, it's not going to happen. And that's just sadly the case in a lot of Africa. And this comes despite a cumulative total since the end of colonialism. This comes despite trillions of dollars of foreign aid that have come into Africa. And you can point to certain things that it has done, but it has not made these countries wealthy. It has not made them developed countries. And one of the influences on Wade was an economist from Ghana named George Aite. And he did a bunch of research about this question. And he said, look, foreign aid is not going to make Africa wealthy. And in fact, the socialism that came after independence for most African countries was framed as being authentically African, but it was actually from the West. A lot of the people who were in these independence movements were educated in the West. And they were educated at Western universities where they were taught about socialism. And then they came back to their native countries and made socialist governments. And what Aite did is he looked at pre-colonial African history. So before the Europeans were ever there. And he finds rich and deep traditions in Africa of free markets, of trade. This was not a despotic place. It became one, first from far off colonial powers, and then from socialist powers. But it wasn't that before. And so what Wade says is that free enterprise is her birthright as an African. And what she wants to try to do is set up startup cities. The idea being that you would have a special economic zone where all the business laws start from scratch. And you can create a good business environment in one specific area in an African country. Let people move there, let people start businesses there, and just see what happens. Because right now, there's all these government laws in the way from preventing that stuff from happening. And it's not that Africans are unable to start businesses as people. They totally can, just like anybody else anywhere else in the world. And we see this all the time when Africans move to other countries. They're very entrepreneurial. They start businesses because they're allowed to. And that's really the hope that Magatte Wade has for Africa. And so I encourage you to look at some of her stuff. Like I said, I interviewed her for National Review. You can find my story at nationalreview.com. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show, and it makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. So I did the paper of the episode this time from the Journal of Applied Economics in May 2011 by Robert Lucas of the University of Chicago. What Economists Do. This was a lecture that he gave, that Robert Lucas gave, at the commencement address. He gave it as the commencement address at the University of Chicago in 1988. So the actual article is, or the actual speech is older than the publication, but it was published in 2011. And what he does here is he says, what are economists for? What do I actually do as an economist? Robert Lucas, one of the greatest economists of the 20th century, just recently passed away. He says, really what economists are is storytellers, which is sort of a weird answer. But he goes through a story about an amusement park and about the tickets in the amusement park. And he says, how could I make a depression or a boom in the amusement park? I could probably do it by changing the number of tickets in circulation. And it's an example about the money supply and about how the money supply affects an economy. But he says, look, I have to tell a story about this because I can't actually go out and test it in the real world. No economy is going to let me go out there and try to create a depression to see what happens. That's not going to work. That would be terrible. So we have to tell stories about it. And then we can compare stories with other people and say, well, did your story make sense? I think it kind of does. Or, I'm not sure about that. I don't think that really makes very much sense. Let's change the story this way. What would that do? And so, again, it's kind of a weird answer to say economists are storytellers, but he says that's what economists do. He says we're storytellers operating much of the time in worlds of make-believe. We do not find that the realm of imagination and ideas is an alternative to or a retreat from practical reality. On the contrary, it's the only way we have found to think seriously about reality. That's What Economists Do by Lucas. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.